Welcome to tonight's event for the Belfast International Arts Festival. We are delighted you could join us. My name is Richard Wakely and I am the festival's Artistic Director and Chief Executive. Tonight we're screening a recent conversation with two outstanding local writers, Colette Bryce and Nick Laird. Colette Bryce is a poet from Derry and has published several collections including The Whole and Rain Domed Universe in 2014. Colette Bryce is a poet from Derry and has published several collections including The Whole and Rain Domed Universe in 2014, which received a Ewart Biggs Award in memory of Seamus Heaney. Selected Poems, drawing on all her books, won the Peggy Prize for Irish Poetry in 2018. Colette is also a freelance writer and editor of the highly regarded journal of poetry, Poetry Ireland Review. Her new collection is The M Pages, and it's her sixth collection in a career studded with awards and acclaim. Nick Laird was born in County Tyrone, but now lives in New York. He is not just a poet, but he is also a novelist and a former litigator. Nick teaches at NYU and is Professor of Creative Writing at the Seamus Heaney Centre in Belfast. His latest collection of poetry is titled Feel Free and was described by The Guardian as outstanding and unmissable. Books by these two writers, including their latest collections, are available in person or online from No Alibis Bookshop in Botanic Avenue, Belfast. Now, if you enjoy what you're seeing this evening, please consider joining us again over this final weekend of the festival, where we are featuring more wonderful writers and authors, including Sebastian Barry and Sarah Moss, Brian Washington and Paul Mendes, Jenny Offal, Scholastic Mokasonga and Nina Barari, and on Sunday evening, a US presidential election special with Sarah Churchwell and Michelle Cressfield, hosted by our own Fintan O'Toole. For more information on all our events, please go to our website www.belfastinternationalartsfestival.com. Thank you for watching and enjoy the conversation.
Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Belfast International Arts Festival for this very special COVID edition, where I, Peggy Hughes, am joined by Colette Bryce and Nick Laird across time and space, thanks to the power of Zoom. It's very, very nice to be with them and to have you join us this evening. Thank you so much, wherever in the world you are. We're very pleased you could be here in this bewildering year. Format-wise, we're in for a lovely time. We're going to hear a little bit from both Colette's collection, The M Pages, this one, and from Nick's collection, Feel Free. We will have a little conversation among ourselves, and then we will finish on a poem. And I hope very much that you'll be moved when we've bid each other goodbye to go and seek out these two absolutely wonderful collections from No Alibis, who are doing the book selling for the festival. Because as a course of action, I can't recommend that highly enough. They're truly astonishing collections. So I'll say a little bit more about Colette and then Nick, and then I think we'll just kick off with some poems. So Colette Bryce was born in Derry in 1970, and after studying in England, she settled in London for some years, where she received an Eric Gregory Award in 1995 and won the National Poetry Competition in 2003. She's published poetry collections with Picador, including The Whole and Rain Domed Universe in 2014. She was the recipient of a Christopher Ewart Biggs Award in memory of Seamus Heaney, and a Selected Poems came out in 2017. She's held literary fellowships at various universities around and about the UK, in Ireland and the US, and currently lives in Newcastle-Upon-Tyne, where she works as a freelance writer and editor. And as I say, we'll be hearing today from her latest collection, The M Pages. Nick Laird is the recipient of many prizes for his poetry and fiction, including the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, the Ireland Chair of Poetry Award, the Betty Trask Prize, a Somerset Maugham Award, and the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. He's on the faculty at New York University and Professor of Creative Writing at the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's University in Belfast. His latest collection, Feel Free, from which we will hear today, was shortlisted for the T S Eliot Prize and for the Derek Walcott Prize. I think that's the worst of it, guys, when you have to sit over Zoom and listen to your own bios read to you, so hopefully it'll get better from here. But I think we'll go first with, I think, would either of you prefer to go first, actually, to kick us off? We're going to have 3 poems.
Should we do one each, Colette?
Oh, nice.
So we have first.
Okay, let's do that.
That's nice, yeah. Great.
Okay, you start, Nick. Go
on then. Okay, I'll just read 3 wee lyrics, and I'll do one, and then this is called an American poem, and it's a poem I did for Extinction Rebellion recently. American poem. I hoped to visit tropical resorts to feel that texture of expensive sadness. I wanted to be so large I would not fit in the machine, but thinking everything was magic was the same as thinking nothing was. Magnets, racecraft, 3-card Monte. I know nothing of your grief, granted, nor you mine, but isn't that why we're here? No philosopher ever went into the deli on Mercer and Spring and asked Muhammad just to make her whatever sandwich the universe had preordained. I, for one, hope to stop reliving things I said once that were only mildly funny. I have this hunch all of us now are living in the knowledge we are living in a failed state of bad faith, and hence we shelter in denunciation poems of innocence and hurt, our innocence, our hurt, while happily we're rapidly extracting rotted bodies from the earth, all the liquid dead we nurse our little systems on until they stop their beeping, until, engorged as ticks, we burst.
Okay. Well, I'll pick up on that dead at the end there. And I thought I would read the first poem in this new book. It's called Death of an Actress. And I think the speaker in this poem is kind of repeatedly failing to describe the event of the title, using some of Shakespeare's euphemisms for death. Death of an Actress. She has, as chimney sweepers, come to dust and bitten it. She has given up the ghost and lies in cold obstruction there to rot. Where angel stubs perfect untimely frost, now she frights me thus living flesh, does yield soft saply to the axe's edge. Has gasped her last, pegged out, gone west, mislaid the future like a set of specs or a loop of keys, has booted the bucket, dimmed her light to the glow knob of a wick and snuffed it, passed onto the kingdom of perpetual night, hooked up with darkness as a bride, shuffled, mortal, crossed the Styx into history. She has joined the great majority, sloughed off her body like a costume coat, discarded on the carpet, dearly departed sleep, bed down with beauty slain and beauty dead, black chaos comes again.
It's lovely. I notice, Colette, you and I talked before about your mum, but I see she was a silk cut smoker as well. So I'll just read that wee poem, Silk Cut, from Feel Free. Silk Cut. I was 5 and stood beside my dad at a junction somewhere in Dublin when I slipped my hand in his and met the red end of a cigarette. But now our hearts are broken. We walk down to the Bray side where we can get a proper pint. And his voice tears up a bit about the emptiness in the house. And we are going home, waiting at the turn for the traffic, when I find I have to stop my hand from taking his.
I think the brand actually turns up in this book as well, Nick.
Yeah.
It's a very Northern Ireland brand, I think. So this one's called Perfect Smile. The time has arrived again to attend to my bite, now that my bark is perfected. Time to attend to my toothstones, chisels, choppers, nippers, laughing gear, my string of pearls, my wolfish incisors, molars, mashers, porcelain shelves. And newer Sevres pleases, old ones crack. 3 teeth, he says, holding up 3 fingers. Jaws sink down into warm putty. The soft thwap of removal, muttered approvals, Paris attacks on the news. Before some asinine pop that takes you back. Okay, fine. The shrill malarial whine of the drilling enters your brain on burning threads as your grip on the armrests tightens, jaws widen, ache like the jaws of a python, measuring up to the unexpected breakfast of a goat. Eyes shut, you retreat to a tropical island far away, perhaps that very one where Selkirk was king, government, and nation. The snake will require a longish siesta after this, while you retrieve your coat from the hook on the door and slink through reception with its ad campaign for Invisalign, the clear alternative to braces. Into the aircon cavern of your car to inspect each fang in the rearview mirror.
I love that. Now that my bark is perfected. I read a newish poem that was just published in the summer called Property. There's a train going past. What I think I know about the sunset is the trees appear to be rising in front of it. Rising in front of the brilliant, splintered, overripe light toward animate clouds arrayed and edged in greys and dusky pinks, a few blues, damson, pastel, and that scalloping excellent white. I didn't mention the green that is pushing itself everywhere, my being. And I was just slightly stoned down in the gazebo, having sat by the dam on the Mumbacus Creek, smoking for half an hour, waiting for the beaver to come back. It did not. The only sound was a cardinal in the trees, and when overhead 14 geese honked me and headed south, and now my children up in Jackie's garden, arguing, ignoring the pleas of the babysitter I am paying $20 an hour. I saw a red cardinal up at the car once one weekend here last spring, so fiercely territorial, his own reflection in the wing mirror meant he spent a good hour trying to repel the imaginary intruder. I find sometimes I want all of it. The moment of sunset, the beaver's architected dam, the colours, the babysitter, the soundtrack of an endless quarrel, an evening to go on and on burning. Cocteau was asked if his home was on fire, what one thing would he save? The fire, he said, only the fire.
Like I spotted that poem online the other day and I was really enjoying it. In fact, it made me want to smoke and sit by a river doing so. So this last one I'll read for now is, it's another kind of surreal one from the book. I'll just give you a wee bit of background. I was working in the Oscar Wilde Centre in Dublin at Trinity, and it's 21 Westland Row, and it's where Oscar Wilde was born. And I was reading about him and that he died at 46, and I was 46, and he died of results of an ear infection. And I was sitting there with a burst eardrum, and I was sitting in this little attic at the top of the house. And every day when I looked out, there was a derelict house opposite, and there was a pigeon looking back at me from behind the glass, which seemed a sort of strange reversal of the order of things. So lots of this kind of middle-aged paranoia and other things came into this poem, which hopefully became its own thing. This is called Drum. There's a broken pane in the window of my ear, the act of a vandal, a black triangle. The pigeons are in and it will take a renovation to reclaim. Alas, there are no plans pending, and a grey dove peers out early most mornings through the murk, surveying the street below, harried commuters slanting to their work. Where the pigeon retreats to, I don't know, but often the window holds only unfathomable dark and the flag of a black triangle. It may be, in fact, a succession of pigeons playing the bird at various points of its life, like the hair wash scene by Almodovar, where a woman bows down over a basin, then emerges from the towel a different actress than before, older, sadder, lined, like an early photographer rising from the cloak of her machine to a world devoid of colour.
Thanks both very much. That was a really nice way of doing it, actually. Unplanned, but really nice. Thank you. Normally there'd be a round of applause. I apologise. It's only me at this point, but I'm sure that people would join me in applauding. I think I just want to begin by asking you a little bit more, if I may, just about the weather in which these collections were made, were put together. You know, they're landing with us today in an exceptionally funny period, but I think it would be nice to hear just a little bit more, maybe Nick, you first, just about Feel Free and the atmospheric pressure that brought it together.
It feels like quite far away from me now, that book. You know, it came out, I think, a couple of years ago now, so I don't know what you're like, Colette, but you like your poems maybe for a week and then afterwards you're just mortified by them, so to go back to them feels like someone else wrote them. Everything's so awful at the minute that it's hard to remember a time when it wasn't quite as awful. But certainly since 2016 and Brexit and Trump arrived in the kind of atmosphere, things have seemed to be going the wrong direction, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I suppose written out of that, my mother had just died, so that some of the poems were written out of that. I think up to this book, really, poetry had always been kind of exploratory for me, and I sort of wanted to talk to Colette about this too with the M pages, but it certainly became with this book maybe slightly consolatory rather than just exploratory. So I think the poetry maybe in this book was doing something slightly different for me, trying to put grief into words, trying to kind of bind it up in some way. And certainly I think after those poems were written, I did something that I never usually would do. I kind of went back and reread the poems, partly for consolation, which was an odd thing for me. So something like that. Yeah. Did you find that, Colette, with yours, this kind of consolation? Oh, sorry, Peggy, I'm doing your job.
Go for it, Nick. No, you're fine. Carry on. Yep.
I just wanted to, I suppose in the M pages in particular, I wanted to ask about that. Did you find that it was consoling to write those poems?
That's an interesting word, consoling, was it? It felt really necessary at the time. You know, I think I've always had this suspicion that other poets sit down with an intent to write a poem and do it, you know, whereas I've always found that I'm sort of going the other way around. I'm sort of following where it leads. And I think with this, there was a kind of compulsion. This is the M pages sequence, which sits kind of in the middle of a triptych in this book, was the last thing I wrote for the book. And suddenly the other poems kind of made sense. They were refracting in and out of the book, whereas I didn't even realize that I was that close to having a collection, you know. So whether or not it was consoling is an interesting question. I don't think I can really answer it. I think it was writing, you know, about grief isn't always the same as elegy, is it, Nick? It's kind of, there's a different kind of writing about it, which is more about trying to make sense of an experience. And I think just writing out of that material of what happens and then trying to kind of understand it. And I think poetry's always been my kind of way of understanding experience, and especially some of the most kind of intense experience. So I think for that would have been really what was going on, was more just trying to understand what was going on while writing those poems, you know.
Can I just ask then, Nick, something you said about going back to the poems and sort of seeking or maybe finding consolation there. Were you writing them with a mind to console?
No, I don't think so. I think a way of putting down. So I'm like Colette. I do sit down all the time, really every day, and try and write. But I never think I'm going to write a poem about this pigeon or whatever the thing is. It's much more a question of, the Paul Clay line about taking a line for a walk and seeing where it goes, and trying to let whatever is going on in the subconscious rise to the surface. So trying to be open and free. But it turns out that when you're kind of in grief for your mother, the only thing that comes up is this repeated thing. And I think I find that, right, I don't know whether it's a good thing or not, because it becomes the poem becomes the grief in a way. When you go back, the things that you remember and put in the poems are the things that then become kind of solidified as the memory. But it certainly was for me a kind of way of binding the grief and holding it in place, putting it in words. I think it was helpful, I suppose. I was just sort of surprised by it, because I'd never really thought of poetry, and I know it sounds stupid, I'm a poet, but I'd never thought of poetry in that sense, as a kind of way of offering consolation to the maker of the verse, perhaps, as well as, I would read other people's, say, Heaney's clearances or whatever, and you can see that is helpful when you're dealing with your own grief. But I wondered if Colette had that experience of going back to the poem even after it was written and finding a way of dealing with one's own grief. Do you ever read your own poems, Colette?
No, never. Sometimes it's difficult to go back, to poems like this. And I find that I've had a very strange experience of this book, because I think writing poems out of experiences like that can feel very exposing. Even though it is a representation and it's not the thing itself, but even so, you can have that feeling about it. And then actually what happened was that I published this straight into lockdown, into the jaws of a pandemic, which was, another really strange experience, because it was almost like I hadn't published it at all. So I have gone back a couple of times and I've read through that sequence in particular, and it still shocks me, some of the boundaries at which it presses and kind of moves up against very uncomfortable places in grief, which is, I think, it's very different for everybody, but it's not always a sentimental kind of experience. There's also a lot of shock and other emotions sort of caught up in it. So yeah, I think that it can certainly reactivate all that when you go back and read those poems. Do you find that it kind of refreshes those feelings that you...
It's sort of 3 years now, so less and less. But I see what you mean about the triptych in your book. Whenever I read it, I was with the poem you read, Death of an Actress. So much literature in this book, Colette, as well, of course, the MacNeice and the Bishop and the Shakespeare, everything coming in. But it did seem like this abstract idea of death and the way that the language deals with it, and then the collection becomes more and more focused on this actual death, the death of the sister, and then going away at the end. In that last section, so much about kind of tropes of sort of loneliness or solitariness or emigration or little ways of moving away from it. I was taken with the last one about the inspector on the beach who tracks those trails of human spoor to the point at which they always disappear. I thought it was a very well constructed collection, which is not a common thing. I mean, I love your work, but I love the way that it came in very specifically in the middle and then moved out into the abstract again with different ways of approaching something.
Well, so thanks, Nick, for taking such care in reading it. I think that's exactly what I kind of, when I was putting it together, I was thinking of those Renaissance triptychs where you often have an entombment in the central panel.
Yeah.
This kind of started to happen, and I mean it's a slim book. There's not really that much of it, but there it is, and I think we're all, sometimes you'll have heard it, Nick said that sometimes we think we're writing the one book in installments, so there is that sense of, it's your latest offering, but you're always moving on to the next poem is always the thing that you're chasing. And Yeah, I suppose we're always just seeking that new kind of the findings that we're after. I've lost my train here, so somebody help me.
You're fine. I did wonder if I could ask you both. Colette, I'll maybe come to you first on this one. Just kind of a bit more about Nick just said it is a very literary book, lots of references in there, lots of kind of ghosts, if you like, in that sense in there. Could you say a little bit more about those influences that have come together in this book? And Nick, I'm going to come to you as well on incantations, which obviously draws on other voices. But you first, please, Colette.
Yeah, that started to happen very naturally, and I think it might be a result of just being steeped in poems for far too long. You know, that you start to think in poems and you start to think in lines of poems. So you know, often I'm often describing things through little phrases from poems that I sort of carry around in my head. So this started to happen certainly in the earliest poems that I wrote for the book. It was happening quite naturally, and I quite liked it. So I let them kind of weave in, you know, poems like Hire Car and stuff, which was, you know, had originally been supposed to be about ambulances, and so these poems from Larkin's Ambulances and then McNeice's Care On and whatnot started coming in. I like that idea of almost that tapestry idea of, you know, weaving in a thread of something else, and in many cases they're quite well known threads. But I think when it came to the end pages, the second poem in that sort of revisits famous poems that have visited this theme before. So Sylvia Plath, Emily Dickinson comes in. Emily Dickinson comes in a lot because I'm a little bit addicted to Dickinson. I like to read one a day like a vitamin pill, you know, to keep yourself in mind of what a poem is. So I quite liked when that happened, and it happened to be a little bit less as the book went on. So I don't know if that's something that's going to recur, but and I hope, you know, I hope it's all right for the reader that this kind of slight intertextuality starts to happen. I hope it's not an interruption as such, you know, when it comes to reading the poem.
I wouldn't have said so. It's funny, I have down here in front of me on my notes something that I think I'm quoting Maeve McGookian, who's quoting Emily Dickinson, saying that the things she saw in her work, or that kind of idea that she was saying things that couldn't be said in language, I think is a really nice idea when it comes to Dickinson's poetry. And that was something I was going to put to you, but I think we could come back to it. But Nick, what of you then? What about your the people who haunt this collection?
I don't know that there's any poets in particular that haunt it really. I'm trying to see what's in it. No, just the people who've always haunted the work, really. So the people I read, your kind of first poets, the people I read at school, like Heaney and Maughan and Longley, and then, you know, poets that I've been reading much more recently, like Ashbery or whoever, contemporary American poets I've been looking at. And so I suppose it's, you try and keep your first voice, the kind of language of the tribe, the dialect you grew up speaking, and try to do as much as you can with it in terms of variation, what the poem will take, as it were, and try and, I'm sort of interested in tone. I like poems to try and do different things with tone, stretch them out a wee bit, take them for a run. So all of that, I do try and make, you know, the poems different. I'm always interested. What keeps me interested is trying to do something kind of new, you know, between poems. But there we are.
Could I ask Nick a little question? How much do you think, like, living in the States and the American tradition has influenced your kind of recent developments? There's a real expansion, I think, in your work that seems to be ongoing, and in your line as well.
It is a different tradition, the American tradition, you know, and I think whenever you go, but Dickinson is one end of it, you know, with those wee short 4/3 lyrics, everything that can be sung to amazing grace. Poems, which, once you realise that, it's hard to read them.
You shouldn't have said that, Nick.
No, but obviously I love Dickinson, but at the other end of that is the long line, is Whitman. So, you know, and that line comes through, you know, C.K. Williams and our own Kieran Carson, and
yeah,
but not common at this end of it, these sort of long anaphoric lines. And this, sort of pole between, I suppose at one end of the spectrum is sort of Ashbery's looseness, this idea. Heaney talked about it as dropping a bucket down into the well of consciousness and pulling up and seeing what you have. And I was against that for a long time, even really when I moved to America 10 years ago, couldn't see the point of it at all. But then through reading, I suppose, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, the Ashbery, the great long Ashbery poem, started to see much more sort of value in that slightly freer approach. But I find it hard not to end up writing in stanzas, not to end up writing in lines of, I'm interested in a kind of visual order as well, and a kind of sonic neatness. So I do always find myself, the kind of British-Irish side is always wrestling the poem back into some kind of shape, even as this kind of American side wants it, to be freed. So maybe that's an interesting place to be. It certainly keeps, sort of me interested in it. I don't know. Do you read much contemporary American stuff, Claire?
I do, yeah. No, I do keep up. There's I've been reading Claudia Rankine in recent years a lot. I like her stuff, and also I like her kind of playing around with the total variability of form it brings in. But yeah, in general, I do keep an eye on the States as much as I can. I'm a bit steeped in the Irish poem at the moment through Poetry Ireland Review, so I'm reading a lot of submissions. But yeah, no, I do have a strong...
In the submissions, do you notice the kind of, is it still mostly stanza-led work, lines of a roughly similar length, or is there a kind of Americanization like there is in every other part of our culture?
No, I think that Ireland is holding out. So it's still quite, I suppose, fairly traditional and what we're receiving, at the magazine. We get some prose poems and things, but generally the lyric is still prevalent over there. Yeah.
We get a lot of the prose poems now in my workshops in America, which I'm finding a bit exhausting. The prose poem, I want it to die. I want it to go away. Yeah. I think you lose so much of it, so I'm really sort of sick of it, but I imagine it'll pass like old fashions.
I want to ask you, but following on from that, I had wanted to ask you a little bit about, in terms of not accents, say, but speech rhythms and the things that can travel with the poetry and the things that can't. So I'm thinking maybe more of someone like Anna Burns's Milkman, that people, I'm aware, find very challenging in terms of its speech patterns. Whereas if you're from Northern Ireland, it's any mother, really. I find it very comforting in a sense. I wonder for you both, having been away from the place for a good while, what's lost, or what can't you bring with you in the work, if anything, Nick?
I don't know. I haven't lived in Northern Ireland since I was 18. I go back and forward to Belfast, and I go back to West Cork a lot, where my mother's family was from. So I did kind of keep, I suppose, one ear open to Irish voices in lots of ways, and I suppose it is that music is kind of set. Your ear is kind of set early, I suppose. The kind of what we call it, the sound of sense that Frost would talk about. This kind of poetry. This Ezra Pound talked about the best way to hear the rhythm of sentences is to listen to a conversation from behind a door. Not that you can't hear the words, but you can hear the kind of music of the language. And I think you do grow up hearing that, and it stays with you. That kind of store box of musical phrases. I don't mean phrases as in the words, but I mean the kind of music. So I think that you can't really get rid of that. It's just sort of there. I think the idea is to try and see what you can work in terms of different diction and tone and speech patternings. And I'm just babbling now. Colette, help me out.
Well, I was just going to say, I think you've said it all there. I wouldn't really have that much to add. As you can hear, my accent has stayed strongly with me all these years, even though, like Nick, I left at 18. Obviously been over and back a lot, and I'm spending a lot of time, as much time as I can, in Dublin these days. But yeah, that sort of baseline, I think, of your own inherited speech patterns and that northern voice is definitely where I would be coming from, you know. And I think it's probably, it'd be interesting, I couldn't possibly answer so quickly, but it'd be interesting to think about what then gets overlaid and woven into that in possibly interesting ways. Good question, though. I'll have to have a think.
Do you edit with your eye first, Colette, or your ear?
I think probably the ear, yeah, because it's all about the sound and rhythm, largely. So, yeah, I think most of what I do is by ear, to be honest, and the kind of harmonics. You're asking hard questions.
Am I? Are these hard? Sorry.
These are quite hard, yeah. What about you, Nick?
I don't know if I'd put one before the other. I suppose the process of editing is just sort of anything could happen in it. But yeah, I know, Colette, I suppose I was going to ask you as well, partly always in your work, but certainly rhyme plays, let's say it's foregrounded more than is common now, I think, in much contemporary poetry. And I wondered in like the end pages where the rhyme almost seems to lead to another section. Sometimes it seems like the rhyme is sort of pulling the mind through it in some way. Does that make any sense? You know, like especially whenever one section takes off from the last section, or the first line goes from the first line of a new section goes from the last line of a previous section, or
Yeah,
itself was doing part of the work of motion.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and it can look like I think my editor could say, "You got to get rid of that." You know, it's like it can, in another way of looking at it, it can be a fault, if you know what I mean. Because rhyme, of course, we don't want to overuse either or have it jumping out like that. So I think I know. I'm thinking about where you're referring to, where it pulls it through and picks up in the first line. Yeah, it's just that sense of, Nick, you know, that sense of song. I think in some of your shorter lyrics, there's certainly that, to my ear, when I read those, that sense that there's a tune to a poem. And it's interesting what you were saying about the pull between the two traditions in yours, because then you can also do that very much kind of almost unmetered kind of voice at the other end of the spectrum. But whenever you're writing in that kind of lyric form, I think it's in that music.
I think the song is now difficult to teach. I don't mean it's like song lyrics itself, but to try and talk about poetry as still as song can be a hard thing to talk to students about. And I do sort of think, like with Dickinson or whoever else, that is the lyric stuff that I think was my first love and is still sort of my main love in some way. But it can be hard to try and tell undergrads that this is also a part of poetry, that it's not, that these small, delicate lyrics that sometimes are about transmitting kind of private intimacies one-to-one, that sort of inner lyrical voice can be sort of drowned out sometimes by the big public declarations and these larger, sort of noisier poems.
I think so. I think the short poem remains very, very hard to write. You know, it's harder, and it is because of that kind of total condensing of the sound pattern, you know, so everything has to work very closely together. And luckily I don't have to tell undergraduates anything. I'm completely jobless in a pandemic, which was really, I really played a blinder there. But yeah, no, but I mean, I think it must be hard teaching right now because there are very strong fashions going on. I guess there probably always are, you know, but yeah, as you say, there's a bit of a dominant strain at the moment in what's seen as fashionable. But I think these come and go as, you know, you start to get a longer view.
Yeah.
And what's important stays there, you know.
But I did want to ask you about that editorial role. Obviously, Poetry Ireland, Colette, but also Nick, the Zoo of the New with Don Patterson some years ago, and just what it is that you look for as readers and curators of those books. Nick, what do you look for?
I mean, if I say I look for good poetry, that sounds a glib response, but you know what, when you see it, you know, I want a poem that is surprising and yet inevitable in some way. You know, I want a line that I didn't expect but seems right in retrospect. So I want to read other people's work and feel that the poet is in control of all of their effects. It doesn't seem to be, nothing is accidental. So, you know, all those things. And so putting together like a big anthology like The Zoo, The New, is just sort of going through all of one's own books and my commonplace book where I write some poems down I like and discussing them with Dawn, who's also, of course, Colette's editor. You know, we'd similar taste. We'd known each other a long time, so it wasn't a difficult enterprise. It took forever because we would just sit and argue on Skype for quite a lot in the evenings, but fun, yeah. But I don't know. Do you have a definition, Colette, of what you're looking for in a poem?
Oh God, no. And quite the reverse, really. You're always looking to be surprised, aren't you? And I suppose energy is central for me. That you want some energy in the writing, and some kind of inevitability that you think, God, this had to be this piece, you know. So yeah, definitely just looking for something new. I'm not. So I think to go in there thinking that you knew what a good poem was would end up being a very boring kind of anthology or magazine or whatever. You want. I
do want something that tells me something I didn't know in some way. I don't want something that just repeats kind of truisms or orthodoxy. So I want a poem that will. Muldoon talks about it as clarifying something, however small, and there's something in that. Just some little precision achieved is kind of interesting to me. Maybe some description, maybe some kind of sound, but something that just seems to work right.
Yeah. And sometimes just a weirdness, a strangeness, you know, in the execution of the piece. Like
in Apartment, which I just thought was such a wonderful little poem. It's one of Colette's poems. That odd, first of all, it's got all that wonderful sound play, but that odd little image, just a kind of surreal image. Well, maybe could I ask you to read the poem?
Aye, yeah, lovely.
Oh gosh, I've never read out that poem. Nick, you're putting me on the spot here.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not
find it. Well, I guess this could, you know, we're in this solitude kind of space, aren't we? It probably fits in a little bit with that. Apartment. The quietness in rooms suspends like throngs of weightless polystyrene balls, closely but not densely packed, so that advancing, you enter an electric caress as it parts and closes around you. How would you breathe? A flaw in the dream? Perhaps you could don a snorkel mask and only this, as you swim through the silk molecular bliss of your living room, exulting in the morning.
I love that poem, and that little kind of sneaky, cheeky little image of just donning the snorkel mask and swimming through the molecules in your living room. I just loved it. The poem doesn't go where one expects. But
I think I wrote that after, it was the first time I'd lived alone for hundreds of years. For a short period, I was living alone, and this sense of stillness and solitude felt almost physical, you know.
I suppose what's interesting to me about a poem like that is that the thought can go anywhere because it's held together sonically, it's held together by the music of the poem. So it seems complete and inevitable whilst heading off in a surprising, interesting direction.
Oh, thank you, Nick.
Something very of Bishop in that closely but not densely packed, the swerve and then that correction of the. I see Bishop in some of these poems in a way that I felt I haven't seen before. Sorry, I'll stop.
Have you noticed, Peggy, that this turns into a game of tennis? I have to, I have to get him back now, and talk to you about Cinna the poet, which I'm sure you can't have forgotten that you wrote this, because I found in a notebook the other day that I'd written down lots of quotes out of it in my notebook, and I think there were some parts of it that were speaking directly about what was going on in the States at the time, where I assume you must have been when you were writing it.
Yes.
That bit, how they massed in the streets for their Caesar.
That rapist, that racist, that fat narcissist who found the crowd responded best to flattery and 3-word phrases framed as an imperative.
Absolutely nailed it there, I think.
Yeah, it was a strange poem, that. And I think trying on something else, certainly for me, to try and write something directly like in that way about Trump. But I'd been thinking about Sin of the Poet. It's from Julius Caesar, the Shakespeare play, and it was a real incident where this guy, Sin of the Poet, happened to share the name of one of the conspirators, Sin of the Conspirator. So he was kind of jumped on by Caesar's supporters, and in the play, Shakespeare has him say, I'm not Sin of the Conspirator, I'm Sin of the Poet, and then they shout, tear him for his bad verses, and then they kill him, even though they know he's not Sin of the Conspirator. So yeah, I suppose I was trying to write sort of in a historical pattern to look at how there's always been Trumps in that way, and yeah.
Oh, what a thought! There's always been Trumps. A terrible idea. I've just got one more question for you both, and then I think we'll move to or finish and the final poem from each of you as well. My question is just something that the late lovely Dennis O'Driscoll said, where he thought that of any poet's body of work, it could be not estimated, but maybe suggested just by one word. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, that just one word could tie up a whole set of books and ideas. Do you have any sense, the question is, of what one word would yours be?
Fragilistic expialidocious.
I think somebody said this to me. Somebody suggested that it was disappear.
Oh, that's very good.
And actually, the really embarrassing thing is that it is the last word in this book.
Yeah.
So I'm trapped in this holding pattern of disappearance. So
Self-effacement.
What about you, Nick? What do you think?
Full Indian rope trick. Is it the end and disappear as well? Of course.
Yeah. I'm obviously working some central trauma, over and over again.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I can't think of anything for that.
You're not. It'll come to you. It'll come to you in the dark watches of the night sometime. Nick will think it's whatever.
Mope, which is MOPE and is an anagram of poem. Word.
Yeah.
I'm going to, if I may, just give the hard sell again, because these are just two extraordinary collections, and there we are. That's Nick's Feel Free and Colette's The M Pages, and they're available at lots of good bookshops, but we would especially endorse the wonderful No Alibis in Belfast. So if you can, I'd firmly recommend. And just to thank everyone who's tuned in for your time this evening, and to thank very much, of course, Nick and Colette for what for me has been a really fascinating conversation. I didn't have to do much, and it was a real treat. But I'll hand over now for your final two poems. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Peggy. Shall I do one and then you do one?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to read it's 2 pages, a slightly longer poem, which I just finished yesterday, called Sheep's Head, which is the second peninsula up in West Cork, where I spend the summers. So Sheep's Head is where J.G. Farrell, the novelist, drowned. And of course, there's the wonderful Mahon poem, A Dish is Shed in Wexford, in memory of it. Because that was in the back of my mind too. But I'll read this poem. Today I opened the door on the light, and the light rain falling on the water, on the roof of the hire car, on Vera's field and its 3 cattle waiting out the weather, and on a mobile of gannets twisting above the crib of the harbour, angling, buffeted, tacking bright sails to the gusts of light rain coming off the stroppy Atlantic. The light was the light of nowhere, emanating off the Caha Mountains, the gable, the colourless sea, to be absorbed instantly by the ruined pewter sky. where the gannets perfect gannetness, practicing this immense control followed by collapse. The contraptions of themselves, the thin apparatus of their empires, contracted to the sharpest point before the fall, choreographing a series of fabulous vanishings that stipple the dark road. As I'm checking for the mail, a leggy and sizable spider abseils off the letterbox, pursued along his line by a few sliding raindrops, suent as the chain of boys set out for the muscle lines that crest and dip but fail to advance on the salmon farm they aim at. The circular cage net John Murphy waited 3 years to replace after the last big storm. The light rain darkens the goat's path and the lane to the cove, the bite in the cliff, the rib jetty and immense ring of the mooring rusting back to nothing, flakes of time, and a few seagulls bobbing on the swell, and a brass plaque embedded in the black rock where Farrell was spinning for mackerel and got taken by a wave. At the Church of Ireland churchyard at Durris, a light rain is falling on the yew, if a yew grows there, where the routine is granted its beautiful due, and rain is aching off the tips of its leaves as they're planting farrel in the ground which has always been holy, if only for the reason that the yew grows there. With uproar and boredom as themes, upsets of almost grace appear in the realm and must take for an instant the shapes of the place. And with John Murphy's fish farm, the nets got wrecked as the storm made landfall. The rain chucked itself in buckets at the panes. The wind continually was stricken in the chimney, and out there an exit where only net was before. From the rip in the continuum, salmon thrashing in liveried propulsion, a swell and glitter, thousands separately nosing downwards to these dimensions of no end, I guess, since it was October, and I was in Manhattan, stopping late for lunch, taking the library stairs 2 at a time to stroll through the square where the pianist plays Haydn on the baby grand he wheels out into the sun every morning from somewhere, unenclosed, heading every direction.
Oh, thank you, Nick. And I'll read one last one here. This is a kind of self-isolation fantasy before it became a thing and much less attractive. And I should just say this is probably written out, it's the last poem in the book, and it was written out of that noise of the Brexit years, you know, all that ugly shouting. I think I wasn't the only person who was harbouring an escape fantasy at that time and now, crikey. A last post. My ideal job, inspector of the tide line, the ocean's eyebrow. After the sea has sucked in its breath and closed its lashes. I'd live in a wrecked Bishopian shack, the lion's paw prints massive in the sand, and always in weather like this, in tattered old shorts and a vest, my skin salted. A currency of driftwood and feathers, necklaces of wrack like cured leather, I collect in a basket to barter with the wind. With shells and fish hooks, alphabet of bird bone and twig, I'd fashion flotsam poems in my utter element, pottering along, far from the roar and heat of politics. Odd times a hound might spring out of nowhere after a ball, an anorak owner in its wake. Or I'd wave to the lone kayaker, buoyant always as a bath toy in the waves. But really, at home with my own company, I'd be barely curious enough to track those trails of human spore to the point at which they always disappear.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Peggy. Thanks very much.
Peggy.